Okay, welcome everybody to the second session of Communist University 2025. My name is Anne McShane. I'm a supporter of the CPGB living in Ireland. I'm very glad to be back here again for this Communist University and looking forward to the debate. So I'm very also happy to welcome Rida Vaquas, who's going to speak today for us on war, peace and communist strategy. Rida is going to speak for approximately 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion and questions. Okay, thanks, Rida.
Hi, I'm Rida. I'm doing my best to talk as loudly as I possibly can. But apologies if it's not working. I'm involved in Prometheus. Some people might remember me from my involvement in Momentum, in which I did a great many things, and some of them are stupid. But anyway, I want to open this talk firstly by talking about the origins of socialist anti-militarism, the conditions for its emergence, and the legacy up until 1914, when it obviously collapsed. I want to do this because it's often claimed that a vigorous anti-militarism amounts to a kind of pacifist idealism that simply cannot hold true in any situation where a war actually breaks out. In effect, I find that the left today tends to return to the old refrain of Karl Kautsky during World War I, that if the proletariat is too weak to prevent the outbreak of war, then it's clearly too weak to act in any kind of way to end one. However, the first socialist positions about war emerged in a time of war, the wars of national unification and intra-European conquest and annexations. These were different kinds of wars to the wars that we are now familiar with today, undoubtedly, but in many ways they provided the conceptual frameworks that made these wars possible. So I'm going to focus on the German movement as the earliest self-consciously Marxist movement, and secondly, where as a mass working class party, the decisions they made and the strategies and the programmatic demand for a people's militia instead of a standing army were debated time and time again throughout the Social Democratic Party's history. But even before the Social Democratic Party was founded through the Unification Congress in Gotha in 1875, Aldous Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht recognized the necessity of a basic attitude to militarism within a party program. What I hope to draw out through this discussion is that the question of the standing army and the question of armaments are fundamentally questions of how much democracy is possible within a state form. It is a question of how much destructive force a state can wield, both at home and abroad, to pursue its will. And the more destructive force a state can wield, and in fact has a monopoly over, the more autonomy it has from popular control and accountability. Not only by the fact that it can use brute force to suppress dissent, but the fact that the highly destructive forces we have to hand today necessitate secret keeping. They necessitate military programs that are included from the sight of the state citizens. So in talking about the debates about a militia versus a standing army and providing funds for armaments and military technologies, we are talking about a democratic question, not just a finance question. So this is why the first program of the first party that Aldous Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht founded, the Sächsische Volkspartei, sorry to German speakers for my poor pronunciation, in 1866, they include in their program as part of the demands for democracy a people's militia instead of a standing army, a parliament endowed with the greatest powers, including the right to make decisions about war and peace. This is point number one as part of the demand for universal suffrage. It's hence conceived as a cross-class democratic demand. It's important to note here that the Sächsische Volkspartei, although many of its delegates come from radicalized workers' educational associations, is not a socialist party, but a party allied with radical Democrats and left liberals in an effort to combat Prussian dominance. Some members of Ferdinand Lassalle's organization attend the RDLV, albeit with reservations. And it's a program that was passed immediately in the aftermath of the war, the Austro-Prussian War, cementing Austria's exclusion from a unified Germany and ensuring Prussian dominance of the North German Confederation. And it was passed in Prussian-occupied Saxony. The main workers' organization at the time, Lassalle's organization, the RDLV, I'm using Lassallian as a shorthand of the actual picture of the RDLV at this point was considerably a lot more mixed and not straightforwardly Lassallian, but you'll have to just bear with me. So they had conceptualized the war as an opportunity to gain concessions from Bismarck. John Baptist von Schweitzer, the RDLV's effective leader after Lassalle's death, spoke at the outbreak of the war in 16th June 1866 in what we might call today realist terms. He condemned the war as a civil war driven by dynastic interests, but blamed the liberal bourgeoisie, in particular those favouring a small German solution, as having failed to provide any political alternative. The choice, as he put it, was between Austria and Prussia. And in this, he saw an opportunity for the RDLV to press Bismarck for universal suffrage, including within the Prussian state parliament, counting on the idea Bismarck needed more support than he had. Bismarck himself had dangled the idea of some form of universal suffrage on 9th April in order to break the deadlock in the German Confederation, but this had been met with horror by liberals and conservatives alike. Fabel and Liebknecht, while agreeing with arguments of the war being a civil war and a dynastic war and one driven by the interests of princes, they agreed with all that. But they saw it as demonstrating the risk of Prussia gaining dominance in a future unified Germany. In a resolution passed in Leipzig in May 1866, they denounced the imminent war in these terms. We consider direct or indirect support of this un-German policy to be detrimental to the interests of the German people. This interest can only be safeguarded by a parliament elected through universal, equal and direct elections by secret ballots, supported by a general people's militia. In the event when the war broke out on 16th June, Prussia won it remarkably swiftly. It became known as the 7-Week War. The Battle of Königgrätz became the largest battle of the 19th century in Europe and involved 500,000 troops. The Prussian side benefited from the innovations of railways, so they could concentrate and supply troops much more effectively, and the Dreisen needle gun, which Engels and Marx discuss at great length, which could fire 4 to 5 rounds a minute, despite its many other limitations. It was what an historian called an 18th century war fought with 19th century technology. It was fundamentally about preserving or upturning a particular balance of power across European princely states. Just prior to the war breaking out, the Austrian Brigade left its headquarters in Kiel as the band of the Prussian Marines played the Austrian national anthem. I just included this detail because it kind of gives you an idea of the very, very different conceptualization of war that was going on at the time these debates were being had. There's this sort of concept of chivalry and noble behavior that is kind of unthinkable in this sort of like mass scale industrial slaughter we see today. And Prussia, as a result, they annexed Hanover, Nassau, and Frankfurt. So this is the immediate context of the demand for a people's militia as opposed to a standing army. It is the knowledge of what armies can achieve. It is the standing army is seen as an institution of reaction in significant part because Prussia wields it so effectively against others. When Bebel sits down to write his memoirs in the first decade of the 20th century, he still describes this war as the catastrophe of 1866. He went as far as to say, for a people in a state of unfreedom, a military defeat is more conducive to their internal development than it is an obstacle. He then drew a comparison to the 1905 Russian Revolution occurring after Russia's defeat against Japan. Time and time again in the years following 1866, Liebknecht insists that had there been militias instead of standing armies, the civil war would have been unthinkable. In the assemblies and meetings where they're passing resolutions against Prussia, there are a mix of bourgeois liberals who basically just don't want a Prussian-dominated unified Germany, and radical workers. I think it's fair to say that in this context, the programmatic demand for a militia did not come out of a worked-out socialist theory towards war and peace, but radical democratic convictions. For reference, Marx's comments on the Austro-Prussian War include, besides the Great Prussian defeat, which perhaps, but those Berliners might have led to a revolution, there could have been no better outcome than their stupendous victory. He also makes what I think is a revealing comment about military technology. What he proposes to Engels that he should write a chapter of Capital that's basically sort of proving their economic theory, looking at the military industry. And he says, is there any sphere in which our theory that the organization of labor is determined by the means of production, is it more dazzlingly vindicated than in the industry for human slaughter? Of course, both the Sächsische Volkspartei and the Lassallean Ardea parties of a few thousand men at this point. It comes back to this war being an 18th century war being fought in the 19th century. It sets the stage for clashes between the Lassalleans and Liebknecht in the North German Reichstag in 1867, to which they were both elected. When Liebknecht opposed compulsory military service, Schweitzer retorted that he was in league with dispossessed princes and envious foreigners seeking to destroy the North German Federation. Liebknecht accused Schweitzer of being the doppelganger of one of Bismarck's closest policy counsels, Wagner, so no love was lost between them. However, Liebknecht and Bebel did refine their thought on war and peace in the intervening 2 years. And in 1868, when Bebel was chair of the Verband der Deutsche Arbeitervereine, an organization of workers' educational associations that had been politicized to the left since 1863, they created the basis of what we now know as the Eisenach wing of the Social Democratic Party. They did this by passing a resolution declaring that the emancipation of the working classes must be the work of these classes themselves, and affiliating the organization to the International Working Men's Association, i.e. the First International. Despite the attempt of the organization's right wing to remove the discussion from the agenda altogether, this is a move that anyone who's familiar with the Labour Party will be very intimately familiar with. The motion was debated after all, and 69 delegates voted for the motion. When it was accepted, the 41 who voted against just left the room. Having effectively split the organization, Liebknecht then moved another resolution, which was unanimously accepted. And it said that it was a duty of workers of all nations to work towards the abolition of the standing army and the introduction of universal civic militias. Part of the resolution read, in that it further gives princes the power to pursue wars against the will and wishes of their people, and moreover, to disregard the will of the people. The standing army is the source of a persistent threat of war abroad, and the means of dynastic wars of conquest abroad, and the suppression of rights and freedoms at home. In his speech for the motion, Liebknecht sketches out a fundamentally democratic critique of the standing army, that it places an excessive taxation burden on the masses, that its force is directed against the people or nation that it is meant to defend, and that it forces people into dynastic wars against their own interests. It is very much the perspective of a man who saw Prussian soldiers press the barricades of 1848. He draws a direct contrast between the Austro-Prussian War and the American Civil War. A militia, he says, can be defeated but never vanquished. He directly predicts a war between France and Prussia and argues that it cannot and should not take a national character. He argues every defeat of Napoleonic Caesarism is a victory for the French people. Every defeat of a Bismarckian Caesarism is a victory for the German people. It is a defeatism of a sort, but not what we would recognize as a revolutionary defeatism. It's specific to the situation of Prussia and France, representing at the time anti-republican despotic powers. The logic roughly runs that a military defeat for such a nation can be practically liberating for its peoples, but it all but implies a different approach if a nation engaged in a war is formally democratic. This confusion is also relied upon when it comes to the moment of crisis in 1914. This position at this time does not attract controversy. It's in fact far less controversial than the questions of the peasantry and the land. The Eisenach Program of 1869, explicitly founding the Social Democratische Arbeiterpartei, adopts the same programmatic point of a militia instead of a standing army with very similar wording. The sincerity and consistency of these resolutions would be tested in very short order, and their utility in providing a political strategy for socialists to follow. By the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. The Franco-Prussian War is, I think, the war that casts a shadow over the social democratic approach to World War I. It is where the concepts of a defensive war and an offensive war are set out as terms of analysis within a part of the socialist strategy. When Karl Kautsky writes about the Balkan Wars preceding the First World War, he compares them to the Franco-Prussian War. Strikingly, as World War I rages on, you can find a debate between Edward Bernstein and David Ryazanov on the positions that Marx and Engels took in the Franco-Prussian War. Fable's positions around offensive and defensive wars are invoked against the position of the Spartacus League. This in itself is an object lesson in the uses and misuses of the socialist past. Right. That socialist today still. Sorry, take a minute. Sorry, I had a cold last week and still have like a lingering cough that's like not going away. So this in itself is an object lesson in the uses and misuses of the socialist past that socialists today still fall prey to. Using this war as an example, based on superficial similarities, allowed many within the socialist tradition to deceive themselves about what the war was, a conflict limited to European belligerence, with particular disputes in which one could identify aggressor and victim nations. They did not recognize it for what it was, a war of empire. The Franco-Prussian War was the largest conflict between the Napoleonic Wars and World War I. It involved 2 million soldiers and could boast 180,000 fatalities. It included many novelties, universal conscription, civilians as legitimate targets for bombardment, and the deployment of Algerian infantry against Prussia. And I want to point out again that the democratic press was aghast at what it saw as the innovations of modern warfare. One German paper recorded, "This slaughter of thousands has grown into a monster, the hunger of which it will be impossible to satisfy. Our weapons are now so sophisticated that in regard to their potential for destruction, they leave almost nothing to be desired. But nonetheless, they will again be improved considerably. Our projectiles, shrapnel shells, mitrailleuses, sorry, I can't pronounce French, and needle guns already devour so much human flesh that the forces of the biggest nations hardly permit us to wage war for longer than 4 weeks without completely incapacitating each other. What will happen if there are further improvements, and if, with our speed of maneuver, the war will consume at least a third more flesh than it already does? We've lived to see that expand exponentially." Fable and Liebknecht, of course, did not know what the war would become when the question was first brought to the Reichstag of the North German Federation. It had been Napoleon who declared war, not Bismarck. This misled many into characterizing the war as a defensive one, including Liebknecht initially in his early articles for the Volksstaat. In Marx's first address to the International, he too warns the German people of the dangers of the war losing its defensive character. If the German working class allows the present war to lose its strictly defensive character and to degenerate into a war against the French people, victory or defeat will prove alike disastrous. Bebel and Liebknecht abstained on the question of war credits. They recorded their reasons in the Reichstag proceedings, stating they cannot vote for war credits as that would be a vote of confidence in the Prussian government, but they cannot refuse the war credits as this could be interpreted as the support of the criminal policies of Bonaparte. They say, as principled opponents of every dynastic war, as social republicans and members of the International Working Men's Association that fights against all oppressors without making any distinction of nationality and seeks to unite the oppressed into a great fraternity, we cannot directly nor indirectly declare ourselves for the present war, and hence are withholding our vote, by which we express the confident hope that the people of Europe will learn from the current catastrophic events and will do all in their power to conquer the right of their self-determination for themselves and abolish today's class rule and rule by the sword, which are the fundamental cause of all state and social evil. When Bebel recounts this in the 20th century, he admits to making one mistake. He thought he and Liebknecht should have voted against the war credit and not just abstain, as Bismarck had clearly provoked the war. Bebel and Liebknecht's politics were consistent with the resolutions they passed, which were, as they emphasized time and time again, concerned with dynastic war. Schweitzer and the deputies from the RDRA, by contrast, in the first vote, they voted for the war credit. Bebel and Liebknecht's position was denounced by the Braunschweig Committee of their own party, who furiously denounced the Liebknecht monarchy when he refused to edit the party paper to express their views. Liebknecht, in fact, had suggested later in November that he would have voted for the war had he had any faith in Bismarck. Marx's first address to the International that I quoted earlier actually quoted the Braunschweig Committee's resolution that they stated that they were forced to undergo a defensive war as an unavoidable evil. Marx, of course, swiftly realized it was not a defensive war fought by Prussia, and the historical record ultimately proved it had been Bismarck and not Napoleon who had instigated the war. After the Battle of Sedan, of course, when it became clear to all the sides to see that the war was aimed at annexing Alsace-Lorraine, all socialists opposed the war in the Reichstag. For their efforts, Bebel and Liebknecht were arrested and imprisoned on charges of high treason. It might seem that so far what I've done is sketched out a fairly prolonged history of the principled model. This is because I want to underline that so much of socialist thinking on war has been a model, and elements of this particular model have persisted right into our thinking in the present day through unlikely routes of inheritance. I want to bring out a couple of concepts from this that have been used to justify many socialist positions throughout the long 20th century. Firstly, that there are meaningfully different kinds of wars, such as dynastic wars and defensive wars. A dynastic war is now obviously an obsolete concept thanks to the redrawing of the map following the wars of the 20th century. But there are definitely wars in which it is much easier to oppose participation in today, and there are wars where we feel on some level that we have some kind of duty to express some kind of position on. A defensive war, on the other hand, it's seen as the spit of necessity, and it's fought for survival and not for expansionism and annexation. And it's very easy to grasp the moral appeal of this, and we see it often, not least when it comes to various positions around the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, that, okay, Ukraine has been invaded, so it has to fight back, and therefore you should vote these ridiculous arms deals and support bourgeois governments profiting from the arms trade because they have to beat Russia. This is not a position I imagine that people in this room hold, but it is a position that you do encounter a lot on the left. Rosa Luxemburg pointed out when the Spartacus group was reproached with such a logic of the defensive war that you can't meaningfully make distinctions between wars of offense and defense in an imperialist capitalist world. As she said, wars are always simply the result of deeply rooted and far-reaching conflicts of interest that erupt violently because they can no longer peacefully be solved. If you want to talk about the aggressor and the defender at the outbreak of war, the question really boils down to who shuffled their diplomatic cards most skillfully at the very last moment. Socialists are often keen to insist that we are not pacifists, and so to imply that there are kinds of wars we would support. One better question to ask ourselves before we put too much distance between ourselves and pacifists is this. Is the kind of war we would support actually possible under the present economic and political system? Is it even possible for wars as they are waged now to be something else than mass civilian slaughter for the narrow geopolitical gain by one group of capitalists or another? I am not a military expert, and perhaps someone listening will inform me of an ideal war that socialists can throw their weight behind as a worthy cause. But we need to see, as the more far-sighted of the Marxists before us, each conflict not simply in its local particulars of who struck who first, but within the overarching context. In 2024, there were 29 active conflicts, including 78 countries involved in conflicts beyond their own borders. Many of these countries would claim that they are supporting another country's justified defensive war. There is a secondary model around the question of defeatism. Babel and Leibniz's statements on both the Austro-Prussian War and the Franco-Prussian War are in many ways startlingly radical to our ears because they openly declare that the defeat of Prussia could be a good thing. Prior to German unification, of course, this was not quite the same as calling for the defeat of one's own nation. But it was justified on grounds that Prussia was despotic and comparable to the Tsar, and hence the defeat of the regime that people did not identify with or see as legitimate rulers can open the way for the popular masses to overthrow it. In the 1870s as well, this wasn't seen as a task unique to the working class. But defeatism is not presented as a general rule that one could risk for the defeat in whatever state you find yourself in, or transform the war into a class war, as socialists would call for in World War I. It opened the way for the defeatism for thee but not for me that would plague socialists during World War I. It was a minority of anti-war socialists who saw World War I for what it was at the very beginning of the war. John Macquarie, the Scottish socialist in 1914, made the point that Prussianism was only one imperial power amongst the others, not just exceptionally more avaricious and cruel, and made the point that the absurdity of the present situation is sorely apparent when we see British socialists going out to murder German socialists with the object of crushing Kaiserism and Prussian militarism. There is a third model, which is not so much a confusion but a weak argument, which is that one of the ways a standing army is a means of oppression for the people is the financial burden placed upon the people through taxation. In one of Leibniz's speeches, he talks of it as the ruin of national prosperity. Again, it's an easy argument to make, and one that forms much of social democracy's anti-militarist propaganda, that these votes for a bigger navy and better battleships are votes for your own immiseration. And even today, many of the left-wing arguments on military spending focus on what the money could be spent on instead. They are not then arguments against military spending in itself that directly take on the questions of what purpose such military spending is serving. But also, before I move on to a discussion about how the approach changed and the unfortunate ways it didn't, when the dynastic wars of the mid-19th century morphed into the grotesque imperial wars of the 20th century, it's worth drawing upon some of the positive elements of this legacy that represent ways through some of these confusions. One is the association of the militia with democracy. In 1898 to 1899, there was a debate in the now unified and legal SPD about keeping the demand for a civic militia in the programme. The revisionist Max Sippel divided it, first under a pseudonym, then under his own name, by misusing Engels to claim militias are not effective at fighting wars, you could not have a professional modern army through 1 year of military service, and finally that it would not be as economically beneficial as its proponents claimed. Leading to the defence of the militia demand was Karl Kautsky, which is, whenever you read Karl Kautsky in the 1890s, I just want to say you always want to be like, what happened to you, man? Like, what happened? He poured scorn on Sippel's attempts to discredit the militia. He led with pointing out that neither Sippel nor him are qualified to talk about military techniques, but thankfully that's not pertinent because the militia question is, in the first instance, a political question, a question of democracy, and further that the main advantages of the militia system are political, not economic. Luxemburg goes further when he responds to von Zoll's book in 1911 about a new model of an army, and argues that the demand for a militia is not separable from the demand for the decisions about peace and war being made by popular representation. In her words, the modern course of world politics, together with its colonial and military adventures, goes hand in hand with progressively shutting out Parliament from any involvement in foreign policy. This has only become truer. They indicate something to us about how we should see militarism. It's not simply a question of the economic burden it places on a state's citizens or about the scale of destruction it spells out in a war. It's a constraint on democratic life, on what kind of politics are possible. The second point on the positive legacy of the experience of the Franco-Prussian War, and I think relevant to our time, where we simply don't have a mass working class socialist party yet, is the importance of speaking the truth about what is going on. Bebel and Liebknecht took a very difficult position, not necessarily for thoroughly theoretically worked out reasons, but there was no question at this time of effectively stopping the war. The German workers' movement was far too split for this to be the case in June and July of 1870, even if opinion changed later. When they presented a motion in November 1870 following the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine for the rejection of war credits, Bebel explicitly says to the Reichstag, "We are demanding nothing more and nothing less than the rejection of the financial allocations needed to continue the war. We are not expecting you to agree. To ask that of you would be foolishness on our part." He is presenting the position as the correct path. Both Bebel and Liebknecht paid for, at that time, a relatively high price for speaking such truth. Bebel underwent trial in the space of the next 2 years for high treason and for insulting the emperor. For high treason, he received a sentence of 2 years in prison, and for insulting the emperor 9 months and the revocation of his Reichstag seat, which was seen as a sort of prosecutorial overstep. I want to point out here that this despotic Prussian regime for charges such as high treason gave out much more lenient sentences than the sentences protesters have been given for sitting down in front of a motorway recently. And even though the prosecutor revoked the Bebel's Reichstag seat, they could not actually stop his successful re-election. Those serving custodial sentences in Britain today will not even have the right to vote. I say this just to make clear that we are not living in an era of democracy's triumph, that even though the sort of good guys won World War I and World War II, the good guys have become quite bad. However, in the instance where we as socialists cannot do much, if anything, to stop a war, we have a duty not to litigate which side is more justified or cheerlead whichever government we feel is marginally more progressive. It is our duty to illuminate, in the clearest terms, what is really going on and in whose interests the war is being fought. Following the unification of both Germany in 1871 and the German Socialist parties and the German Socialist parties in 1875, the situation, of course, changed dramatically. It is not necessary for me to recite the litany of the SPD's betrayal, the vote for war credit, the Second International collapse, so an absurd justification that it was about defending the fatherland, and the reason we think of it as a massive betrayal is that the SPD could have made a difference at that point. But all of this is, I think, well known to everyone in the room. But it's the attitudes that enabled 4th August 1914 to happen, the confusions that are still with us today that are of concern. The first and most obvious is to focus one's critique of militarism, of the armaments industries on the financial balance sheet alone, to reduce it to immediate self-interest without raising the level of political consciousness overall about what militarism is. And this is what the SPD did. And then when it came to the military bill in 1913, where the new armaments were to be financed by property taxes on the rich, the majority of the SPD right-flag deputies voted for that motion because they said they could not justify to the masses why they were voting against property taxes for the rich. Interestingly, Edward Bernstein voted with the party's left because he hated armaments. We've also had a dramatic decline in the quality of provisions in the subsequent century. The sort of second mistake is to treat colonial wars as extraneous to the state's conduct at home, to treat each conflict in isolation, evaluating it on the rights and wrongs on both sides, deciding who has violated the rights of whom. It is once more an extremely appealing framework, but it is a framework that will corrode your politics from the inside. The 1912 manifesto of the Balkans and Turkey during the Balkan Wars declared something that held true and that the larger socialist parties of the West did not follow. The nationalist argument is really nothing but a pretext for Balkan governments. The true motive of their policy is nothing but the desire for economic and territorial expansion, which characterizes all capitalist countries. I want to bring to fore, when I conclude this, the phrase that Babel and Leibniz used in their initial abstention, that to vote for war would be a vote of confidence. Socialists do not need to be experts on the technical details of every conflict to be able to say loudly and uncompromisingly, we have no confidence in the bourgeois states of today to conduct wars. In tracing the history of the socialist relationship to the problems of war and militarism, we are faced with an obvious problem in translating the staple demand of a people's militia instead of a standing army into the contemporary context. There's firstly the problem of the role of the army. Britain and other developed capitalist countries have given the police all the tools and legal powers they need to handle the internal repression quite nicely by themselves. They are the force that violently disperse protests in the first instance and drag people through the justice system afterwards. The recent prescription of Palestine Action and its subsequent policing indicate more sharply than ever that an anti-militarist politics requires having a strategy to address the police and police powers. The left in this country, if it is serious about anti-war activism, needs not only to demand a repeal of legislation that has restricted the right to protest, but to pose alternative institutions that could fulfill the police functions on the streets. This is where I think the demand for a militia is most translatable. More significantly, this demand for a militia was clearly intended at equalizing the balance of forces between state authority and the people. However, the development of military technology means that we cannot equalize the distribution of forces in any serious way. I'm not simply referring to nuclear bombs here. If we take one look at the Mark 84 bomb, developed by the US in Vietnam, it is a 900-kilogram bomb. Half of its weight comes from explosive material. The lethal radius is 360 meters. It can level buildings for up to 800 meters. With the most up-to-date guidance systems in the world, there is no way such a bomb can ever be a precision weapon. We know about this bomb because Israel used it in 2021, following widespread protests across all of historical Palestine. The New York Times revealed Israel was bombing Gaza with these bombs in 2023. The US recently sold Israel a further 1,600 of these bombs. These are the technologies we know about. No nuclear power has ever developed a nuclear program completely out in the open, subjecting ethics and cost to democratic accountability. So our opposition to armaments is not just that they are an industry for human slaughter, but such an industry undermines the very possibilities for democratic governance in itself. The armaments industry has basically proceeded on a lie of mutually assured destruction. What actually happened is something that is kind of like mutually negotiated and agreed in advance destruction between states with like high destructive forces. We've seen this in the airstrikes between India and Pakistan and Iran's response to being bombed by the US and Israel. In Iran, for instance, we can also see that it is the rogue states who have the most to lose by not playing by the rules of our international rules-based order. Effectively, decisions of war and peace are just being made in diplomatic deals in which civilians are treated as acceptable collateral damage. This is why socialists, and this is my actual ending, sorry I've talked for so long. This is why socialists need to return to the democratic principles underpinning the first critiques of militarism and war. What would decisions about peace and war by an elected parliament look like, as demanded by the Eisenach program, the Gossip program, and the Airford program? It would mean the release of all the details of operations undertaken by spy planes, a full accounting of all the arms trade deals that are undertaken by our government, full scrutiny of whatever diplomatic dealings the UK government is doing. If any organised political party raised such demands, I suspect we'd see the true political colours of the military shockingly quickly, as indicated by some of what we saw in the Corbyn years. Every capitalist institution would turn on it as posing an unacceptable threat to national security. I think this is precisely why the demand has to be raised. So we can see what this so-called national security really consists of. Many of the slogans raised by the left today are reactive to end wars that have been started, to stop the continuation of deals that have already been done. These are correct slogans in themselves, and we stand by disarmament campaigns. We stand with those unambiguously opposing the genocide in Gaza. But if we want to be serious about ending imperialist war, we need to dismantle the conditions by which these wars can take place, i.e. a programmatic alternative to the current state form. And so the demand for a democratic republic is an anti-militarist demand, as is the demand for a people's militia. I want to end by recalling Rosa Luxemburg's first reaction to the vote for war credits in World War I. Her closest collaborator at the time, Hugo Eberlein, rushes to Vaquas to receive news of the vote, and she tells him, "I will put a bullet in my head. That will be the best protest against the betrayal of the party, and maybe it will bring the working masses back to their senses." We are obviously incredibly thankful he did not do that, but he was able to not do that because there was more important work to be done. There was an alternative way to end the war, through the organisation of the working class, through agitating for strikes, through basically raising the political level of the working class to the point they could bring the war to an end. And he could build the infrastructure by which to do that. And we need to build a similar infrastructure today. We need to make sure that there is a better way forward. Because when I see the news in Palestine, I think the people who set themselves on fire, there is something rational about it because it is so horrible. And we need to build a credible political alternative to that horror and to stop that horror. And that is an anti-militarist program and a radically democratic program. And that's me.